I got married in my early 20s and started a family soon after that. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had 6 children with my wife, and as the breadwinner in a time when men worked all day at their jobs and women took care of the children, I was working long hours at a factory job to put food on the table and provide for my family. It was an assembly line job, pulling parts off of a conveyor line and stacking them onto a pallet for shipping. It was monotonous to say the least, but it was the best paying job I could get, and I wasn't going to turn down the overtime since money was always a concern. The downside was that I was always home late at night and I wasn't spending much time with my wife or our kids. But wanting to provide for them meant everything to me, and I just put up with it. My car had been having problems for a while, and one day it just quit running. I was by no means a mechanic, and I didn't have the time to attempt to troubleshoot the problem. I was also quite frugal, and I thought maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to be without a car for a short while, since it would save on having to purchase gasoline. My wife didn't drive and would often get a ride from a friend to go run errands during the day, and I opted to walk to work and back each day. I figured this wouldn't be that big of a deal, and I could just pinch pennies until I had enough saved and could afford the repairs to my car. It was also nice to get some fresh air, and the exercise was good. I left work late one evening, like usual after a long shift, and I started on my walk back home. It was dark out and the streetlights were already on. I walked the same way I had been walking home for about a week or more, and at this point was really looking forward to getting home and having a good dinner. I would stop every so often when I was underneath the streetlight to check the time on my pocket watch. I always liked being punctual and I didn't want my wife to worry, so I made sure I was making good time. At one of my stops, I took out my billfold and I did a quick count of my cash. I probably had less than $10 on me, which isn't much money today, but at this time it was quite a bit of money. It was definitely not the best time for me to be checking my finances, and in retrospect, that one innocent peek inside my billfold is probably what led to what happened next. I closed up my billfold and I stuffed it back into my jacket pocket before continuing my walk. At the time, I was just about 6 feet tall and over 190 pounds solid. I walked with a relatively heavy step, and I could hear the hard soles of my shoes rap against the pavement as I stepped. I had gotten used to this sound in the area because it was relatively vacant this time of night. There were very few cars on the road, so my shoes were about the only sound I ever noticed on those walks home. But on this night, there was another sound that accompanied them. It was the unmistakable sound of another set of shoes hitting against the street, just slightly out of step with mine. At first I thought it might be an echo and I just ignored it for a bit. But then I noticed that the timing of the step would change. It would speed up and then slow down. It was then that I knew that it wasn't echoing that I was hearing, but rather, I was hearing someone else walking behind me. This really shouldn't have bothered me since odds were pretty high that I would eventually see someone walking in this area at night. But when I turned my head to the side slightly to try and catch a glimpse of the other pedestrian, I just saw a dark shape that appeared to quickly retreat out of the glow of the streetlight. I was determined to not let it bother me, and I continued to walk, only this time at a slightly faster pace. At first, I could only hear my steps, and I thought perhaps whoever was walking behind me had turned off onto another street. But after a few minutes, I could once again hear those same distinct footsteps approaching from behind me. I kept up my brisk pace, never stopping as I increased my speed. So did the footsteps I was hearing. I passed under another streetlight, and as I turned my head slightly, I could just make out the silhouette of a very tall, heavy-set person, wearing a hat and walking several feet behind me. It was clear he was following me. I could see that his elbows were bent, meaning that his hands were inside his pockets. He almost seemed to be digging for something in one of them. I was maybe a block from home now, and I did something I never did before. I ran. I reached the back door of my house, shoved it open as hard as I could, and slammed it shut behind me. I peeked outside the window, and there he was, standing there in the dark, just a few feet from my back door. He appeared to be out of breath. His hands were still in his pockets, and his hat brim was tipped down, covering most of his face. I could now see just how large this person was. He was well over the 6-foot mark and at least 230 pounds. He stood there silently, just staring at the door. He then turned around slowly, and he walked away. I don't know if he was planning to rob me or what. I had my wife lock the doors every night after that. I also got my car fixed. I figured I had done enough walking. This happened when I was just turning 11, but I remember it like it was yesterday. It was the middle of the night, and it was summertime, so I didn't have any school the next day. So I just stayed up. My parents were out to dinner, so I was alone in the house. At some point, I started hearing a faint knock outside my window. Now at first I thought nothing of it because there was a bird nest outside of my window frame. But this faint knocking started growing louder and louder. I didn't know what to think of it. And then it stopped. Silence. At first I wanted to call my parents, but After a while of this silence, I fell asleep. It must have been about an hour later when a loud crash woke me from my sleep. I quickly sat up and I looked around at my surroundings, and then I heard another crash. Immediately, I climbed underneath my bed and hid. It was then that I heard a muffled voice.
"Get the kid."
I almost stopped breathing as my room was invaded by several men. I couldn't count all the voices and figure out how many there were, but I could hear them rushing in, stubbing their toes in my messy room, shouting "damn it" as they stepped. Then there was silence as they all started piling out of the room. I immediately came out from under my bed, opened the window, and I got ready to jump. This probably wasn't the smartest idea I've ever had, as I live on the second floor. But what choice did I have? I was hesitating. I was listing all my options inside my head, but they all ended up in me being killed or kidnapped. I looked down again, and behind me I heard one of them coming back up the stairs. I then saw my parents pull into the driveway. I shouted out the window, "Dad, get your gun," in an attempt to scare them away. It didn't work at all. As a man sprinted into my bedroom, I jumped out and landed in the bush. I jumped into my parents' car before they powered the engine up and yelled, "Drive!" They asked me why. I then pointed at the man in our house, staring down at us through my bedroom window. My father immediately stepped on the pedal and we got out of there. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, they were already gone. It's been 6 years now, and I still get shivers every time I hear a noise outside. Me and a friend of mine were walking home from seeing a movie one night. It was one of those action movies, the kind full of beautiful women, explosions, gunplay, a little bit of kung fu, and a happy ending. The kind that gets you real pumped and just begging to get into a fist fight. At least that was how we felt. Since neither of us drove at the time, it meant about a 45-minute walk to get back home. My friend assured me he knew a shortcut back and it would take us about 30 minutes instead of 45. I thought that sounded like a great idea, so I just kind of followed his lead. We'd been walking for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, just sort of talking about the movie we had just seen and how awesome we thought it was. Talking about the fist fights and all the gunplay, how we were just practically begging for somebody to pick a fight with us. My friend was a pretty big guy. At this point I'd say he was around the 6-foot mark and well over 200 pounds. He wasn't in the best of shape, but he had a wrestling background. He was just a big guy. As for me, I was pretty much on the skinny side, and I was hoping if we got into a fight that he could take down at least 2 of them, while I hoped to hold my own against 1. But I figured those were our odds, 3-2. Those sounded like pretty good odds if we did get into a fight. After a while, it became apparent that my buddy didn't know where we were going. He pretended like he did, but we were kind of lost. Every block we walked, we just kept encountering drunk after drunk. They'd always say something stupid to us like, "Hey kids, want to get a drink?" or "Do you have a light?" Well, neither of us smoked, so that was out of the question, and I wasn't about to get drunk with anybody because neither of us drank. I kind of had to trust my friend at that point, because I suffer from something very similar to night blindness. My vision isn't all that great and I do have to wear contact lenses. But at night, everything becomes very opaque, almost black and white, very fuzzy as well. It's really hard for me to see faces and make out details, so I kind of had to follow behind him and let him lead the way. I didn't see I had much of a choice, even though it was obvious he had gotten us lost, but he assured me that he'd get us home safe and sound. At some point, we kind of turned down this embankment. It's near an overpass, I guess you could say. Railroad tracks and all that. I'd never seen it before and it wasn't familiar to me at all, but he assured me that it was the right way to go. We were just starting down the embankment when I could hear a rustling on the sides of us, both sides. At first I thought they were just stones falling down the hill. You know, that kind of thing. My friend stopped, listened for a moment, and then he turned and looked at me and said, "Just be ready." Be ready for what, I thought. What was he talking about? Be ready for what? We took a few more steps, and I realized what he meant. It's not like he has a spider sense or anything like that, but he knew when trouble was around. I think what he was telling me was, we're about to get into a fight. We had walked just a few more feet, and the rustling was louder. I suddenly wanted to take back everything I had inside my head where I'd wished to get into a fist fight. I hadn't considered all the possibilities. In my perfect scenario, there'd be 3 of them. He'd fight 2, I'd fight 1. He'd knock the first 2 guys out, I'd kick somebody in the groin, and that'd be it. Fight would be over. Reality quickly kicked in, though, when all the other scenarios came to life. What if somebody had a gun? What if they had knives? What if there were 5 of them? Maybe 10. This kind of sent a chill down my spine, and my breathing kind of got heavy. I was starting to get a little bit scared, but my friend just looked like he always does. I don't think anything could scare this guy. At least at that point I didn't think it would. We had just gotten out from underneath the lights, so we were walking into a very dark area. Now I was kind of panicked because, as I said, my vision isn't all that great at night. Once I step out of the lights, everything becomes opaque again, kind of black and white. It was then that I started hearing voices. I couldn't make them out at first, but from my estimate, there was about 5 different people talking. They sounded drunk. We just kept up on our pace, and my friend stayed silent. At this point I just wanted to get home because I was really starting to think we might get jumped. I was looking at our surroundings and I realized something. We had made a terrible mistake. Not only were we in the dark, but we were between two hills, on the left and right of us, which meant that the only way for us to go was either back or straight forward. Going uphill was not an option, and from the way it sounded, we were surrounded on both sides of these hills. I then heard somebody laugh, and for the first time, some very incoherent words became clear.
Do you think they have any money?
My friend hit me in the shoulder and he said, "Let's get moving." It was then that we started hearing these banging noises all around us, like somebody taking sticks and whacking them against garbage cans or metal railings or what have you. Someone was really trying to scare us now. We don't live in the worst of areas, but there is a lot of gang activity in some parts of the city, and I do recall seeing some gang graffiti near the overpass. I knew that we needed to get out of there immediately. We started jogging, and that was when we heard the footsteps. We were being chased. We ran and started darting in all directions, trying to lose whoever was behind us. I didn't want to look and I wasn't about to because I didn't want to slow us down or risk that I tripped and someone piled on top of me. We headed for the closest lights that we could find and just started darting down various streets trying to lose whoever was behind us. By the time we got back to my house, I was out of breath and exhausted, ready to collapse. I looked at him and said, "Why did you make us walk that way? I thought you said that was a shortcut." He looked at me and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't want to admit that I was lost. I never took a shortcut again." A few months later, I got my driver's license. I decided no more shortcuts, no more walking. If I want to get someplace, I'll just drive.